Hey, what's up? It's me, Lex, back at you with another video. This is a new series that I'm going to be starting called So You Want to Design an RPG. This is meant to be kind of simultaneously walking through my experiences as I'm designing my own tabletop role-playing game. I've made a few, foundational mechanics in the past, and I talk a lot about design, but I figured that I should maybe try and put something out here so that whether or not I can follow through all the way to publication, although that is my final goal, being able to share my process and my thoughts behind it might be able to inform people and help them to maybe get their own systems out. I love tabletop role-playing. I think that this hobby grows a lot from the contributions of everyone who is interested in it. Anyways, so another thing that is important to say is that despite the fact that this is going to be very widely about designing a system itself and not content for a system, it will still include plenty of advice that I think will be applicable to any game master or even player who's interested in doing a little bit of design, or even just being able to analyze design of the games they're playing. So I hope that this can be useful for you, even if your goal isn't to create a game outright. And then last here is that the sort of pacing of these videos is probably going to be a little different than my normal videos, because I am recording these intentionally as I am creating things, so that I can kind of walk you through my process, my thoughts, my guidelines, etc. I will be preparing things beforehand, and of course I will be working on the system off screen as well. As, for example, here I've typed out all the guidelines that I'm going to be filling in for this episode, and going over what each guideline is meant to kind of lead you towards. Anyways, so that's it for the setup. Let's get right into it. When you're designing anything, the most important thing, and I have this up top, I have it bolded, it's a real easy thing to keep in mind, but it's also a very easy thing, I think, to lose sight of. Ensure that you are making something you are passionate about. If you aren't excited to play your system, if you aren't excited to create the options that you are working on for another system, if what you're making isn't something that you care about, your work is going to suffer. Not necessarily in a quality sense, but as in it will be harder to create things, and it will take longer, and there is the chance that, depending on just the circumstances of creation, that you might end up making something worse than if you were invested in it. So that's always the most important thing. But there's not a whole lot to talk about with that other than saying it up front. So moving right along, what is the game meant to facilitate? What stories do you want to tell, or what setting do you want to bring to life? So this is kind of the overarching, you want to set a design goal here. What is it that you are trying to create? Why can't it be done with things you already have? Other systems, other classes, other feats, etc., depending on what game you're playing. What doesn't exist that you are trying to make exist? And so for me, I have this document is separated out into 3 sections. I have a lore section, which is lore I'm working on for a homebrew world, and the guideline here, which I'm going to be filling out, which will inform my work on system mechanics as I work on actually making the system function. So what kind of stories is the game meant to facilitate? What stories do you want to tell? What setting do you want to bring to life? I want to bring to life my setting, which is focused on several very different levels of power engagement with the world, and has a focus on megastructures. I want playing the game to encourage exploration, downtime, and realistic, slow play well-being. And how would I articulate wanting the game to still play simply, like well, not going overboard on simulationism. All right, so this is an example of the type of thing that you can define, and this will obviously vary by whatever you are creating. As for me, the setting I'm trying to create, just for a very quick primer so that you understand, Valba, Inherited World, is a setting that I've been working on where the idea is that a long time ago there were some incredibly powerful beings. They created towers all over the world, and these towers is just the nomenclature used for essentially superstructures. I was playing a lot of Rain World, if you've played that game before, but any superstructure game will feel correct, where there are these massive, inarticulable, inexplicable creations, and I wanted to emulate that feeling in a game. And alongside that, I have other goals, such as I want the impact of things on the world to be kind of slow and realistic, but I don't want it to be something that you have to kind of dredge your way through. I want, for example, the lifespan of characters to matter, where you might die of old age before you can accomplish everything you want to do, or before you can reach max level. I want exploring the world to feel mysterious and rewarding, but I don't want it to take hours of real life time doing like bookkeeping to get through things, etc. So now we can kind of refine our idea with these next questions. So how do you intend to achieve that goal, this goal up here? How do you intend to bring about what you are trying to create through chance resolution? This is always one of the most important aspects of tabletop role-playing. How do you resolve things when there is a chance they could fail? And then I have at the top of each section a guiding ethos. This is where you want to kind of define the core values of your chance resolution system. And so, for example, here, something you could put in, and this is tentative, this is something that I've been thinking about and I want to play test before I actually lock it in, but I'm going to add it. I want any task can be accomplished by any person, albeit extremely rarely for those without training. So the idea here would be, if you're allowed to attempt it at all, if you're allowed to roll your dice, there should be a chance, no matter how small, that you succeed. And how do you facilitate that, etc. So that's an idea for a guiding ethos. And then you move on to when do you use chance resolution? And chance resolution in my game, I think, should be used as little as possible for now. As a solid groundwork, you want to resolve things in my system, I think, as consistently as you can, and kind of more in an OSR style where people will describe what they want to do, and then the results will simply occur. Rather than rolling dice, you disarm a trap by trying to figure out its mechanics and interrupt them directly. Although I will, of course, with any of these will always be things that you should go back, revisit, see if through playtesting or through evolving your system design, if you should consider changing them, because maybe this changes in the future. Maybe I want more options for dice rolling. And I do think I want to add dice rolling can be used as a fallback when players don't want to engage in OSR style play. So this way it can be kind of like you're rewarded for describing how you disarm a trap, but you still have the option to attempt to disarm it, perhaps. How does it work? Now this is when we get a little bit more into the weeds of direct mechanics, although I would advise staying out of actual codified mechanics when you're working on your guideline. So how does chance resolution work? Well, roll over would be, standard. Match or beat is the default for tabletop role-playing. But I did actually have a kind of interesting idea where you want to roll low, and then you could have proficiency tiers be represented by moving your die step down. So, for example, let's say you wanted to attempt something. You would roll a d20 if you were entirely untrained in it, a d12 if you were just trained, a d10 if you were an expert, so on and so forth, down to a d4. And a 1 would be a success. Or maybe a 1 and a 2, or a 1, 2, and a 3, or a 1, 2, 3, and 4, etc. And this creates a very interesting sort of thing as well, where if a DC is high enough, or I guess in this case it being high means it's easier. If a DC were high enough that your die matched it, then you would just automatically succeed. So that's an idea. But as for guidelines, how does your chance resolution work? I think it would be something that you pull out whenever something is impossible to reason through. For example, lock picking. And it tends to be, I'm going to say I want it to be not punishing unless the players cause it to be. Because I don't want die rolls to be something that is directly risky. I do want them to be worse than being able to reason your way through something, because then you get an automatic success. But I don't want the players to be so disincentivized from rolling dice that it's an actively bad decision. And now that we've gone through this first section here, chance resolution, I'm actually going to skip to the bottom here and cover some guiding principles. These are things that you should keep in mind for every single one of your answers in your guidelines and as you're designing the mechanics themselves. So go down to these, go back up into your guidelines, reference things, edit things, try to stick to these guiding principles. First and foremost, lack of something is a design choice. Space left absent defines as much of a design as the space filled with words. If you intentionally leave an aspect of the game blank, then that is a choice. If there is no difference between a halfling swinging a weapon and a giant swinging the same weapon, just as character choices. So for example, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, all other things being equal, a halfling and a minotaur both swinging the same glaive will deal the same damage. And so that is a intentional lack of design there, in that the size between the two characters does not influence the damage they make. And the outcome of that choice is that characters are not incentivized to be physically larger to be better or at least more devastating combatants. So you have to consider the design that you create in the negative spaces as well. Secondly, justify your design choices. A choice without a reason is a weak one. This just means don't make something for the sake of making something. Make something knowing that it creates interaction or incentivizes choices. If I create a rule, going back to the same example, if I create a rule where larger creatures deal more damage than smaller creatures, That's a design choice, but I need to justify it. I need to reason why, and not just in practical terms, like, oh, the Minotaur is larger, of course the Minotaur would deal more damage, but justify it in game design terms. Like I was saying, you need to reason, of course, that now characters or players who are interested in dealing damage and being like martial combatants will want to be the bigger guy. You need to conceptualize that, justify that in your design. You need to have there be reasons to pick the halfling in that circumstance. And this is kind of about considering that, justifying it within your design, ensuring that you're not just creating best choice options for everything or obvious ways of engagement that beat out everything. And then the final guiding principle here is to communicate the above principles in your writing. Reading your book should feel like a conversation between you and future game masters, the same way playing the game is a conversation between the game master and their players. And this is something that I think is really important for tabletop role-playing. There is a very interesting video put out very recently, actually, that's quite, I think, fitting to this topic. I'll link it down below. It's by Matthew Colville. But he's essentially talking about how at the very beginning of the tabletop role-playing hobby, when D&D first came out, zines were published all around where people were arguing about how to play the game, which ways were fun, which ways weren't, etc., back and forth. And that's continued well into the modern day. But what's important here is that you want to communicate how your game should be played. If your game is about a specific gameplay loop where, players go through this phase and then this phase and then this phase, like for example, Shadow the Weird Wizard expects you to explore, get into a combat, explore, get into a combat, etc., and then you have a single downtime sort of phase between each quest that you go on. That is clearly communicated in the book, and you should strive to do that with your game. You should, I believe, make it clear what your book is intended to accomplish, what your system is intended to accomplish, because otherwise you're leaving it to the imagination of the players to come up with how they engage with your game, and that might end up with, for lack of a better example, what we have with D&D 5th edition, where it is a game that doesn't facilitate a lot of different styles of play very well, but people are homebrewing it really heavily, or just having a worse experience outright than they could be having with other games that are tailor-built for an experience they're trying to have, but they choose to use 5e because 5e isn't clearly communicating the way that it is meant to be played. Either that, or it's trying intentionally to be generic enough that it can be applied to everything. But in either regard, the point is that you want your choices and why you've made them to be clear to the people reading your book, so that they can enjoy the game and play the experience that you've designed as best as possible. So when we take these guiding principles back up here, the lack of restrictions on if someone can attempt a task, they should be able to succeed, is going to create a game where there's sort of this incentive to try everything. And maybe being talented needs to be a particularly strong boost, because otherwise there's very little return on investment when you're putting a bunch of, skill increases or whatever, and someone else without those can succeed. You want to consider that. And then the same thing here, the lack of having as little chance resolution as possible means that the system should support engaging in a more direct manner. It should be clear about that. and it should support the players and the game master in accomplishing that task. And so now we're going to move down into character rules. So the guiding ethos for the character rules of my game, I want there to be 3 tiers of play. And I've already named these out. They have reasons in my lore for being named this. But I want the God tier of play, I want the Pilgrim tier of play, and I want the Inhabitant tier of play. And functionally, I want all 3 of these to be able to go on an adventure together, but they should also very clearly be different levels of investment and different levels of capability. And so I want to say that they should be able to adventure together, but very clearly be on different tiers. Alrighty. Now, next up in the character rules is breadth, and this is meant to be what exactly should be the expanses of your character rules. How out there should your game be able to get? How powerful, how diverse, etc. should your characters be? And for my game, I think that I want, because I have the 3 tiers of play, I kind of have to divide them up. So for God tier play, and in my setting, the term God is used not for actual, like, ascended deities. It's basically incredibly powerful sorcerers. And so for God tier play, I would say something like, I want them to be capable of solving most issues with magic and of engaging with the world on a scale large enough to see on the world map. Long-term plans and rewards that benefit your character and change the world. Alrighty. And then we can talk about the breadth that I want for the Pilgrim tier. I want Pilgrims to essentially be the typical adventurers, ranging from incredibly vulnerable but talented people to those capable of defeating immense threats while still being very much mortal. And then finally, the inhabitants should be just the on the ground human experience of the world. Should still be able to engage alongside pilgrims and gods, but are in a much more precarious position, relying much more on luck. Alrighty. So, because I have the 3 tiers of play, I've sort of bloated this quite a lot. But as you can see here, breadth is kind of talking about the scale of these different modes of play. And this would be, of course, the scale of your characters. For example, in Pathfinder, I would say Pathfinder adventures are probably a little bit higher up than Pilgrims are, because it's a typical adventure. And in Pathfinder they begin as extremely talented people, and they begin as a little bit vulnerable, but then as they increase up in level, and especially past like level 5, they kind of stop feeling mortal. They start being able to accomplish tasks that no creature, or no normal creature without the aid of magic or some incredibly potent biology, like being a massive spider, would be able to accomplish. And I think that I want pilgrims to be a little bit below that. But that's an example of applying something that already exists onto the breadth section here. Now, limitations are kind of like directly applying the lack as a design choice ethos onto the breadth choice here, but we want to codify it out a little bit more. We want to put limitations on our characters so that we know where their ability to engage with the world kind of ends. We want to be able to set these boundaries and these challenges especially. And so limitations are going to be a little bit more free-form. But I do think that I do want to have some in the various tiers of play. For gods, I would like them to struggle with the physicality of adventuring. They are as easy to kill as a pilgrim or inhabitant, despite their immense power. And then for pilgrims, I want their weakness to be forever mortal. They have lifespans and might struggle to fill those, or not to complete their tasks within those years. And then for just general limitations on the world, things that I find interesting to engage with and things that I would like to experiment with as I get into designing system mechanics and playtesting, is I want age should matter. I want size should matter. And I could even just replace size with, I think, species choice should matter. When I was talking earlier about a halfling and a minotaur having the same ability to hit and deal damage, I would like to experiment with having a game where it does matter, where a halfling, because they're smaller, will not deal as much damage with their weapons as a minotaur. And I want to see what I can do with balancing that out, without making it so much that, for example, someone would never play a halfling if they want to be a warrior. I want to see what I can accomplish there, where I want your choice of species to matter, and like the physicality of your characters being, but I don't want it to be so tight that you're not able to engage in avenues that like your species would be challenged at. A halfling should still be able to be a warrior. Abilities. Now, this is kind of an addendum to the breadth section here. This is where you kind of define what level of ability you want characters to be able to take advantage of. And I've already kind of defined it above between breadth and limitations, but this is where you can be a little more explicit with it. And so this is where I want to outline it explicitly as characters should be strictly bound to their reasonable physical restraints, accepting the use of magic or class abilities. And so this is where I'm kind of re-emphasizing and outlining that I want, for example, even a god is still mortal. Despite the massive amount of magic power that they're able to wield, getting stabbed in the gut a couple of times will drop them. And then the same thing with a pilgrim, and the same thing with inhabitants. But then magic allows you to supersede those options. There will be, I want there to not be an option where, for example, in Pathfinder, you might be able to swim. If you pick up the quick swim and become legendary in athletics, you can swim faster than any human in real life has ever swam by multitudes faster. This is just a fun fact, Michael Phelps' swim speed would be 17.6 feet every 2 seconds, which means every action. And if you round that would be 20 feet, so 4 tiles. If you have a swim speed of 20 feet or greater in Pathfinder, you're moving faster than Michael Phelps. Anyway, but that's what I'm talking about here, is I want abilities to kind of be bound to the physicality and reasonability of their characters. Alrighty, and now we get into the last section for the character rules. This is where you put special notes. I'm not sure that I actually have any special notes to fill in, but this is where you'd put in anything that wasn't covered by breadth limitations and abilities. I might want to say things like maybe use modes of play to differentiate different character tiers, something like that, just as a note for myself. And now we're going to get into character progression. And this is part of character rules, but it's an important enough section that it gets its own kind of divided out area for me. The guiding ethos of character progression is that becoming stronger should take time and resources. That's about it. It's pretty simple. I think that rather than leveling up and just becoming stronger overnight or anything like that, it should be a dedicated sort of option. Becoming stronger is a dedicated option rather than a passive result. And this doesn't mean that it won't still take XP to, reach a leveling threshold, but you'll have to go and train to kind of apply that XP, is the idea that I have thus far. For character progression, wide or tall, do you want characters to have more options as they get stronger? Or do you want them to just become kind of immeasurable in the things that they are focusing on? What mixture of those two do you want? I think that with the goals that I've kind of set forth here, I think tall progression is mostly going to be covered by the different modes of play. And so I think wide progression, because wide does also always include a bit of tall in it. Having more options will make you stronger, just purely by virtue of having more options to draw on whenever you face a problem. So I think I want the game to be basically entirely wide, with tall being handled by the tiers of play. Now, for story durations, this is kind of part of character progression. When we're talking about the story of a character, what they get into, why they become adventurers, when they stop becoming adventurers. Story durations kind of means, do you want it to be expected or encouraged for adventurers to retire? Or do you want them to sort of stick around and continue until they die? And then there's any sort of in between as well. But as far as a guiding sort of hand for the game, because if characters are retiring, then, for example, things like inflicting permanent injuries is a much more reasonable thing to do, because if you're only going to be playing with them for a few sessions, 5 or 6 sessions at most, then inflicting them with an injury that presents a temporary challenge they need to overcome before they become retired is perfectly reasonable. Whereas if the expectation is that you're playing with these characters for years, all the way from, level 1 to max level, then you're not going to want to inflict those sorts of permanent difficulties on them unless you're also providing at least some way to get out of them. Or maybe you do, but in general. And so I think for my system, I want story durations. I want gods to be characters you can rely on, but pilgrims and especially inhabitants should be disposable or able to retire. Now, progression timelines. This is sort of the same thing as the guiding ethos up top, where I defined that becoming stronger should take time and resources. Progression timelines, I want it to be, it should take at least a few years before any character can become maximum level. In addition to adventuring. A few years of training before any character can become maximum level, in addition to adventuring. And then finally, the progression narrative. So do you want it to be trained or self-taught? Do you want to encourage any sort of restriction in that way? And I think as far as the progression narrative goes for my game, I would like it to be mostly self-driven, with perhaps some options locked behind tutelage. Now we get into the game rules here. The guiding ethos for the game rules here, and this is a very wide scope of what you want to talk about. This should be how the system responds to the players. When they make choices, how should the game respond to them? And so, for my case, what I'm going for here, my guiding ethos, is a game with a lot of depth and reactivity, such that common sense and realistic physicality can be relied upon without being so detailed as to be unwieldy or require great rules reference. So for example here, going back to the same example, in fact, that I've talked before, being able to have a halfling and a minotaur deal different damage with their weapons might be an example of a simple and easy way to incorporate realistic physicality and common sense. And then the goal would be to incorporate that in a way that is very easy to remember and not get too into the weeds where the game becomes unwieldy or requires a lot of reference. As such, simulationism or gamification here is the next tag, or the next question that we need to kind of focus in on. And that means that my game is going to focus on simulationism, but gamify it enough to be based on reliable frameworks. With simulationism versus gamification being sort of, when you are designing your system, do you prioritize things being realistic, or do you prioritize things being kind of balanced directly in just a vacuum, in a game space? For example, in any hero shooter you might have played, for example. Characters having different pools of hit points is gamification. It is adding hit points and damage thresholds and survivability to characters when realistically a bullet should kill most characters in Team Fortress 2 just outright if it hits them in the right spot. It's focusing on the gamification because being killed outright by a single bullet isn't a ton of fun most of the time. And so I want to focus on kind of making things feel realistic, but while still staying balanced and kind of keeping my eye on game balance here and game design. Codification or absence. This is an important section here because this will inform a lot of what you create in the future. The more things you codify, the more complete your system will be, but also the more likelihood there is for either unintended interactions, for tedious system lookup, or for you to kind of... No, I think it's actually just those two. The more likely it becomes for you to struggle to keep track of everything and have unintended interactions, or the harder it will be for players to be able to reference the rules and understand what's going on. But also, having an absence of rules can create exactly the same issue. I talked about this a bit in one of my blogs the other day, which I will link down below. But if you miss out on codification of certain things, then the GM is going to have to come up with them on the spot. And it also means that players will not be able to create plans that rely on those rules because a ruling hasn't been created yet, or it'll depend on the game master that they're playing with. You know, for example, if the rules for swimming are not clear and defined, then the players can never make a reliable plan that will work at any table to cross a river or to fight in water, etc. And so I think I want to codify the basics and commonalities, but leave the fringes blank. Because then again, having codification can similarly restrict the players. There is an excellent blog post that I will also link down below that talks about how, for example, if you define the rules for attacking creatures that are in your stomach, then you've now sort of outlawed any attempt to attack a creature in your stomach in any way that isn't a way that you've written. And that's, of course, an extreme example, but it's something to keep in mind, is that when you create anything, you're shaping the expectations of both players and game masters and how they'll interact with your game. Now, what aspects of the rules should be important? What aspects of the game rules should be important? These are the things that you're going to want the players to be able to rely on. And it kind of feeds into the next section, which is modes of play. But specifically, I want exploration of the world, interaction with fantastical anomalies or hazards, etc. And I want combat to be important. And I suppose I should also toss in character development. There we go. The things that I find the most fun, the most interesting, the things that I want to be rewarded in my game rules are exploration of the world. The entire conceit of my setting is creating mega structures that are mysterious and that you can explore and find weird things in that you interact with. And so I need exploration of the world and interaction with the fantastical to be important parts of my game. I also just am a real sucker for good character development, being able to make a character that is mechanically interesting and capable and complex. And then I think that combat is one of the more fun aspects of any system that I've played, and so I want it to be a focus of the game and something that people can really sink their teeth into. I want it to be tactical. And now finally we get into modes of play. And this is, again, kind of leaking into having outright mechanics in your guidelines section, so be careful with that here. But modes of play, every TTRPG is going to have different modes of play, and what you want to consider are what base modes you want to support, and then how much or how little you want to support the ability for other subsystems to interact with it. And then you want to consider if there is a cycle to your modes. So for example, like I said before with Shadow of the Weird Wizard, the ability to go through in an exploration mode, into a combat mode, into an exploration mode, into a combat mode, and then at the end of your adventure, you get a single downtime mode, and then you begin the loop again at your next adventure. That is a mode cycle of a few base modes. And so the base modes of play for my system, to kind of satisfy the decisions that I've made earlier in the guideline here, I want there to be an exploration mode. I want there to be an overland exploration mode. I think I would like there to be, since this is kind of going to be a very large-scale game with the ability to play as a god in the game, I would like there to be a overland travel mode, which will distinguish itself from the exploration mode by being much larger scale. For example, the overland exploration mode would be crawling through 3-mile hexes. The overland travel mode would be going across 60-mile hexes, as an easy example. And then I want a combat mode, of course, to be able to facilitate the combat. And now that I got the basics down, I need to kind of heavily consider the other things. Like, for example, do I want a domain mode where, for example, a god, since they're able to engage on a domain level, since they can create kingdoms and amass armies and etc., do I want that to be an option? And I think I do. I want that to be core. And then the last thing is I want there to be, of course, the downtime mode, but with a little parenthesis, and this is going to be for, of course, the long periods of time between adventures, or between even overland exploration, between doing any of the other things. And I want this to be distinct between tiers of play. So, for example, what a god does during downtime should be very different compared to what a pilgrim does or what an inhabitant does. Other than that, I think I'll leave it there. That's already quite a few modes of play. Subsystem supports. I want to allow for other subsystems. Oh my goodness. Subsystems to be created to facilitate other kinds of stories, but never at the expense of my own narrative desires. And then finally, the mode cycle, the cycle of play. And I think for mode cycle, I would like it to look somewhat like downtime, which goes into overland exploration, which goes into exploration and combat. And then I can have these arrows point in both directions to show that it's kind of going back and forth. So be downtime can move into, and I could even have overland travel as an expected mode to engage with. And so this would create a gameplay loop of going from downtime, what you're doing during the time in between, to overland travel to perhaps get farther away. You're seeking something out. Overland exploration, which would be nailing down exactly where it is, into exploration of the thing itself that you've tracked down. Combat exploration, and then finally overland exploration, or perhaps straight over to overland travel again as you go back to wherever you rest and engage in downtime. And so now again would be a great time to look at the guiding principles. Where have we created a design by not putting things in? How can we justify each of the things that we have put in? What are they creating? What are they accomplishing for us? And then this is less important here because I'm talking in the video, but when you get into the system mechanics in particular, how are we communicating exactly what we're trying to accomplish here with our designs? And so this is what the outline is going to look like for me when I get into writing the system mechanics. And I have a guide already kind of set up to begin working on that, that I will be using for my next video in this series, but no promises that'll come next week. This has been something that I hope you have been able to get something from. This is a series that I'm really looking forward to continuing and being able to kind of put together my game. It's obviously very loose here, but this should hopefully provide a good groundwork for those who can use it. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Leave a like if you liked the video. Subscribe if you would like to see more. And I will see you next time. See ya. See ya. Thank you to Sac D, Phoenix FH, and Kizo for donating at the few bucks support tier on my coffee. You're what keeps this channel running. I appreciate it more than I can express. Thank you.